Hello, I'm Sarah Marino of Nature Photo Guides, and today I am going to be talking about 5 different ways to photograph plants and flowers. The reason that I chose this topic for today is because so many of us are looking for ways to connect with our natural environment, our immediate surroundings, while staying close to home. So I thought that I would talk through a couple of ways that I see plants and how I photograph and compose them to maybe give you a couple of new ideas that you might be able to apply in your yard, in a nearby garden, a nearby park, or a nearby nature preserve. So before we get started, I wanted to talk briefly about why I love plants so much. So I have this little cold hardy succulent here that is about to go in my garden. It's still pretty cold here in Colorado, so I'm not quite ready to plant it, but probably in a couple of weeks this will be growing outside, and then in a couple of years hopefully it'll be a nice patch and I'll be able to photograph it in some of the ways that I'm going to talk about today. But I just wanted to give you a little view of this beautiful little plant and talk about some of the reasons that I like photographing plants so much in some of the ways that I'll talk about today. So when I approach nature, I always want to organize chaos and find simplicity and order in really complicated, messy surroundings. And a plant like this is a perfect example of how to do that, because when you look at it, it has a lot of repetition, it has a natural pattern, has some beautiful colors, and there are a lot of different ways to think about photographing it. You could look straight down on it, you could look in, you could have some of it out of focus, you could have it all in focus. So there are a lot of different ways to approach a subject like this. So with that in mind, I'll move to what I think people often think of as macro photography. So when I say that I spend a lot of time photographing plants and flowers, I think that this is what comes to a lot of people's minds, is that a single flower in front of a really colorful background. So we could take a subject like this daisy and do something very similar. So have the camera looking straight at it, with a colorful background, out of focus background, and that's one really traditional approach to taking photographs of plants and flowers. And often the results are really beautiful. So there's nothing wrong with that approach. There are just a lot more approaches. So I'm going to talk about a broader range of looking at plants and flowers as subjects for photography during this tutorial today. So in getting ready to talk about this subject today, I thought about how could I categorize my own portfolio of plants and flowers, and I came up with these 5 examples. So the first is photographing a single subject in its environment. So this would be the same as the poppy example that I gave, but the example here with some dwarf birches shows a little bit more of the environment, and it's all the same plant. But generally, it's still a single subject surrounded by its environment with a colorful out-of-focus background. The second way is to continue on the theme of a single subject, but get a lot closer to it, that all you're focusing on is that single subject, and you're presenting it in a more literal way. So in this particular example, the subject that you see here is a spiral aloe, which is a very rare plant in the United States, but it's one of the most beautiful specimens of succulent that I've ever seen. So here you can see that it's a very literal presentation, meaning that there are a lot of details and you can tell exactly what the subject is. The next way that I think about photographing plants and flowers is still focusing on one subject, but presenting it in a much more dreamy or abstract way. And I'll go into some of the differences about how I think about all of these with a lot more examples later. The next example is probably the most common way that I approach plant and flower photography, mostly because, going back to what I was saying earlier, I really like organizing the world. So finding repetition and patterns is one of the things that I find really satisfying, and then I like being able to present it in photographs. So you can do this in both a literal and an abstract way, but the core of this approach is seeking out patterns and repetition and then presenting that as the key theme of the photograph. And the final example is more abstract and impressionistic, where you're not quite sure what you're looking at. The scale might be confusing, and the subject itself might bring up a lot of curiosity and wonder just because it's presented in a way that's not really literal at all. So these are the 5 ways that I generally think about when I'm approaching a subject in the field. So when I see a subject, I often start by thinking, what's the best way to present this? Like, what is catching my eye? And therefore, what do I want to convey in a photograph? So in the example on the left, I was most interested in the details. So I wanted to be able to present all of those repeating triangles that you see radiating from a center on each of those plants. So by presenting this in a very literal way with a lot of detail, I was able to get that across through this photograph. The middle example still has some literal qualities. Like, you can tell that it's a plant, you can see some of the details, and you have a pretty good idea of what you're looking at. And then the final example is a very abstract presentation of a plant called a desert spoon. So it's these long, kind of spindly tines that kind of radiate out from a center, and they all have, each individual piece has these little prickles on the edges, prickly spines. So by getting really close up to that subject and letting some of it go out of focus and having some of it in focus, I'm able to present it in a way that raises some curiosity about, like, what exactly am I looking at and what is the scale of this plant? So that's the continuum that I think about, from very literal presentations to very abstract presentations with a lot of nuance in the middle. So when we're thinking about that literal presentation versus an abstract presentation, there are two elements that are really, really important. The first is aperture. So that's what that setting will determine a lot of how your resulting photo looks. And then the second is focus. So for literal presentations, I generally go with a subject being fully in focus with a lot of detail. So in the example that you see here on the left, these are hens and chicks that I photographed at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And you can see that there's a lot of detail, that even in the shadows, there's still detail and sharpness. So in this particular case, I looked straight down on the plant and was probably able to photograph it at something like f/16 and get enough depth of field to render all of those details in focus. Another approach is focus stacking, which I'll very briefly review. There's a little more detail than you can go into in a short tutorial like this, but generally the idea behind focus stacking is that if you can't get enough depth of field with an aperture like f/16, then you could focus stack. So you leave everything, all of your settings and your composition exactly the same. The only thing you change is your focus point. So usually I move from the front to the back and then do each of the corners. So in the example that you see here on the left, I might say do 4 or 5 focus points from the foreground to the background and then do each of the corners, just changing the focus point. And then once I get home, I would load all of those files into a software like Helicon Focus, and then it would output a single file that then has all of those individual bands of focus blended together so that I get an image that's fully in focus from front to back. So that's a technique that I use a lot when I can't get enough depth of field just by using my aperture. This middle example is kind of in between, where you have the details in the leaves are really obvious, and then the details in the background are out of focus, and you just get little patches of color. So in this particular case, the background was really far behind the subject, so that's how I got that blurry look while keeping the leaves in focus, probably at an aperture like f8 or f11. And then the final choice is around shallow depth of field. And this is one of the key techniques for achieving that soft, dreamy, impressionistic look. So in that particular case, I would use an aperture like f2.8 or f4, and I'd vary my focus point a lot, experiment a lot, because just minute changes can result in a totally different feel. So aperture and focus are really important decisions as you're deciding how to present a photograph. So these are the 3 approaches that I generally take. But again, this is a continuum with lots of decision points in between that are all determined by how I'm connecting to a plant, how I'm experimenting that day, and how I think I want to present the final result. And I will say that I don't just choose one or the other. This is not a binary choice. I often will say the subject here that you see on the right, so a stringy yucca. I might try a lot of different approaches. I might try to get everything in focus, and then just that really thin slice of focus, and a lot of options in between with different focus points. and then once I get home, see what I like the best. And it might even produce a couple of different photographs of the same subject, just totally different renditions. So now I'm going to go through a lot of examples of how these 5 approaches play out. So this first example is one subject in its environment. And both of these photographs were taken in or around the Florida Everglades. And as you can see with these examples, this approach is really about showing off the star subject. So really focusing on that one thing and then showing it in its larger environment. So in the example on the right, the thing that I loved most about this particular photograph and this subject is that you have that really, really bright bromeliad, and then in the background you have some soft colors with a little bit of echoing. So in terms of composition, I always think about echoes, and echoing color is an example of where your main subject has that kind of limey green, and then the background has a little bit of that limey green as well, so you get a little bit of an echo. But these 2 examples show 2 ways to photograph a single subject with a little bit of environmental context. And then I have 3 more here. This is the least common way that I photograph plants and flowers, so I actually didn't have that many examples, but you can still see a couple of examples here. And one reason that I chose all of these examples is that none of them are flowers. They're all other types of subjects, so thinking beyond flowers so when you think about macro photography or plant and flower photography, we're not just talking about flowers, we're talking about all sorts of things, from leaves on trees to grasses, to large plants, to small plants, to succulents, to flowers, and everything in between. That moving beyond just flowers will really open up your opportunities. So here you can see some different kinds of leaves. I'm not sure what the upper right plant is. I photographed that up in the Pacific Northwest. So if you happen to know what that is, let me know. The other 2 were photographed here around my home in Colorado. One is a scrub oak, and then the other is a dwarf birch. So both of these are examples of how to showcase autumn colors. So by choosing a subject and then showing it within a lot of context and its environment. The next way is this idea of having one subject with a really literal presentation. So again, we're revisiting the spiral aloe, and you can see the really graphic nature of this plant. With lots of repetition, that spiral is really engaging. So I love this plant so much. This is one of my favorite photographs that I've taken, mostly not because it's a great photograph, but because I absolutely love the plant. But this, I think, is a great example of where you're really presenting a subject very literally. You know exactly what it is, there's a lot of detail, and the framing just focuses exactly on that single subject that's the star of your photograph, versus the previous approach where you're showing a lot of context. So here are a couple more examples, and you can see that a few of them get a little bit towards the abstract feel, just by getting a little of the dreamy kind of shallow depth of field, but you still have these are still very literal presentations. You can tell that the subject on the upper right is a yucca, and that the subject on the bottom right is a blooming cactus, even though they both have a little bit of the shallow depth of field thing going on. So these 4 photos also show how you're choosing one star of your photograph. You're getting really close to it, excluding everything else, not showing any of that additional context, but really honing in on that one subject and just focusing on it. The next approach is one subject with an abstract presentation. So you can see in this example, I took a cactus, and it was very small. It was probably the size of the succulent that I showed at the very beginning, so maybe 2 inches across. Got really, really close, chose really shallow depth of field, and just focused on the little tips. So by rendering this in an abstract way, I'm taking away all of the sense of scale, most of the details, and presenting it in kind of a dreamy way, where you have less context and you aren't quite sure what you're looking at or quite sure about some of the details. So in this third approach, abstraction is the most important thing. You're still generally focusing on a single subject and excluding all of the context around it, but you're presenting it in a very different way. So in these cases, I've used shallow depth of field to help obscure what you're looking at. So you can still tell that these are all plants, but they have a much dreamier feel. The lines are a lot softer, lots of curves, So the presentation is much more gentle compared to those literal presentations. So I think that's another difference between approach number 2 and approach number 3, is that the literal approach usually has some harsher lines. The edges feel more dramatic and harsh, whereas an abstract presentation, you're getting into softness and curves and just a more, I think, more elegant and graceful feel. Not that one is right or wrong. It really depends on your subject and your mood and your connections. But these just have a lighter, softer feel to me. So the fourth approach, and again, this is probably my favorite, again, because I want to organize the world, whereas approach number 3 has helped me deal with some of my perfectionist tendencies by just releasing and letting go of control and accepting imperfections. Patterns and repetitions is more indulging my perfectionist tendencies. So really finding a way to organize the world by finding patterns and repetitions in nature, specifically through plants and flowers. So here you can see some mosses in the Canadian Rockies, and you can see that they repeat throughout the frame. And then the little red plants just add little pops of color. Here are some more literal interpretations of repetition. You can see that there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of the subject matter here, but the theme is that there's all a pattern or repetition in these plants. That they feel like they expand beyond the edges of the frame, and that all you see is the same subject repeating over and over and over. So again, this is a way to present or to organize the chaos of nature into a more organized and ordered fashion. Here are some more abstract renditions of patterns and repetition. So you see these kind of dreamy grasses. There's still a lot of those repeating lines. They're all vertical, they're parallel, they're going in some slightly different directions, but you're still getting that sense of repetition. It's just a very, very dreamy feel. The same thing with the blue chalk sticks plant on the right, where there's a little bit more of that dreamy feel with the shallow depth of field, but you're still getting a lot of those repeating parallel lines. Same thing with the white plant on the lower left-hand corner, the repeating dots of white, and then the lupin on the lower right. So these are just a little bit dreamier feel, but the same theme about finding repetition and then being able to communicate that through your framing and your composition. And then finally, the truly abstract and impressionistic approach. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, you approach a plant or a flower with the goal of making it hard to tell exactly what you're looking at. So this is a salsify seed pod, and when you get when you see those, what you would probably think of as gigantic dandelions, they're all over the American West. They're 2 to 3 inches across, and they grow all over, like roadsides and other places. During the summer, they look like wildflowers, and then they turn to seed. But if you get really close with a macro lens and you just throw all the details out of focus and you move your focus point and experiment, you can turn it into something that looks like an octopus or a sea creature. The little edges look like upside down umbrellas. So once you get in and you start experimenting with your focus points and depth of field, you can turn what looks like a weed on the side of the road into a really abstract and impressionistic rendition of a plant. So here are a couple of other examples. Again, the desert spoon that I talked about earlier, and then these two plants that are opposite of each other look like networks. So this is, again, just this looking at, in both cases, a dormant plant, and then photographing the lines and the networks in a way that kind of makes you think, so that's clearly a plant, but I have no idea what I'm really looking at. And then the example on the lower right, that's the same plant that is the previous plant. So here, this is the salsify seed pod, and then the lower right is also salsify seed pod. So you can see how different approaches to the same subject can create completely different results. And in both cases, you really don't have any idea what you're looking at. Or if you saw the seed pod, you'd say, how is that this photo? So with some final thoughts. Right now, we're all working within limitations. So I wanted to show 4 photos that are kind of unconventional subjects. They aren't beautiful, colorful plants at their peak or flowers that are just the peak of their bloom. Instead, these are dormant plants, seed pods, and weeds. So that if you're in a place like me where spring hasn't quite arrived yet, you can look for these kinds of subjects and still make a beautiful photograph out of a dormant or dead plant. So the upper left is a desert holly plant, a dead desert holly plant in Death Valley National Park. And again, just by getting close to it and rendering it slightly out of focus, you get that beautiful feel of the lines and the colors, but you can't really tell that it's a dead plant. The next photo to the right is a weed in my backyard. The lower left is a buckwheat plant in Death Valley National Park that was months past blooming. So that's an example of if you have dormant plants in your yard, you might be able to turn it into something beautiful. And then the final example on the lower right is a plant that had gone to seed. So you don't need peak blooms to make beautiful photographs of plants. I hope that this was helpful in giving you some ideas about different ways that you can approach plants and flowers next time you're out in your immediate environment, at a botanic garden, or out in nature. You can think about choosing a single specimen and presenting it with context around it. You can think about choosing a single subject and really making it the star of the photo, presenting it either in a really literal way or an abstract way. You can think about looking for patterns and repetition. So like I've been talking about, as a way to organize the world and present things in harmony and order. Or you can think about presenting things in a completely abstract way, removing sense of scale and removing the visual cues that help a viewer understand what they're looking at. So I hope that you can take some of these ideas and apply them next time you're out with your camera. If you happen to have any questions about this topic or anything else related to nature photography, feel free to ask in the comments or get in touch with me through my website, which is naturePhotoGuides.com. And again, thanks so much for joining me today. Bye!